Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Connect session. This is Connect session number 5 for February 20th of 2021. So welcome to class, everyone. I apologize that we couldn't meet in person today, but please do note that you should watch both of these videos, complete and submit the group assignment before the end of Sunday the 21st. Please just leave your Miro board whenever you're done, and I will take a look at it. The Miro board will become locked Sunday evening. So you have until then to coordinate with your group to set a time. I will be splitting you into 3 groups for the assignment. So today we're just going to talk about some of those UX interview buzzwords that I mentioned a few sessions ago. These are words that are good to be able to incorporate into your responses during interviews to show that you have industry knowledge and to make sure that you won't get caught off guard with any terminology during the interview. I will briefly touch on some other UX danger words. These are words just to look out for. And then we're going to go over some quick wireframe sketches. I'll take you through my portfolio briefly, and then we will break up for the group assignment. Oh, also please note, I already put this in the Slack channel, but I will be holding a 30-minute Q&A session to make up for the fact that we didn't get one today. That is going to be February 23rd at 7 p.m. EST, and I will post that on the Slack channel. All right, so good UX interview buzzwords is design fidelity, which refers to the level of details and functionality built into a prototype of the project. So there are basically 3 types. You've got low fidelity, which is usually pen and paper, are used to draw the basic skeleton of the application after brainstorming and research. You've got mid fidelity, where we begin to use software tools to make the final structure of the product and positioning of elements in the app. And then finally, on the far right, we have high fidelity. And this is where we focus on the user interface of the product along with the final color scheme and the actual visual interface. And you can look at this graphic anytime that you need a refresher on low to medium to high fidelity. So buzzwords continued. When people say wireframing or wireframes, they're typically referring to low to mid fidelity screens in the design process where there is still no color or graphics. So wireframes are used to ensure and play with the placement of most essential elements of the app. And the graphic that you see on the right, that is for prototyping. Those screens would be high fidelity. When you're thinking of wireframing, think of the low to medium fidelity that you see here. That's usually what people are referring to when they say wireframes. So the main purpose of wireframes is to show the main chunk of content, draw the outlines and layout structure, and depict the most basic elements of the UI. So the most basic definition of a prototype is a simulation or sample version of a final product which is used for testing before launch. The goal is to test products before sinking lots of money into the final product. So the minimum viable product is a type of prototype, though usually clients will want something slightly more developed to conduct testing with unless it's in an agile UX or Scrum environment. The way that I like to think about prototypes is that they are when the wireframe becomes interactive. You can technically have a paper prototype where you draw out screens and you hand users new screens based on what buttons they point to on the paper, but oftentimes prototypes will now be presented to users on test phones or computers. And with prototypes, not all buttons and pages of the prototype will be designed out. The user will only be able to click through a limited number of screens and usually just those user flows and provide feedback from there. So here we can see what a series of screens looks like in Adobe XD once they have been made into a prototype. The lines that you see running between each screen show what app pages are linked or what screen the app will move to when the user clicks on the previous screen. Continuing on with our buzzwords, design specifications simply refer to the design parameters you've been given that you must operate within to make the app adhere to the client guidelines. So design specifications are usually dictated by 2 things. First is, of course, the client will normally give you some kind of design inspiration. Sometimes that could be as vague as, oh, I want the color scheme to be green. Sometimes it could be as specific as, I want it to look like the dark mode version of Netflix on mobile, which is very specific. So always be sure to talk with your client about their expectations for how they want the final product to look. The second type of design specification we'll cover more in detail once we get to the final stages of prototyping, but that is usability guidelines. When designing, it's important to keep in mind users with visual impairments such as color blindness. We want to make sure that we have enough color contrast between our text, our buttons, and our background so that it's easy for all users to use your app. So, and just touching on those user flows again, they are just the visualization of interactions or steps a user needs to complete a specific task on a website or mobile app. Sometimes user flow can also be used interchangeably with task flow. And then next, the 3-click rule is an unofficial web design rule concerning the design of website navigation. And the graphic on the right here is of that 3-click rule. So the 3-click rule suggests that a user or website should be able to find any information in no more than 3 mouse clicks. Keep this in mind when you're designing your apps, as you may have some flows that get too long and require the user to click many times to get where they want to go. The graphic here is of the 3-click rule again, and it's not hard to see how it's a pretty good rule to stick to if your user's having to click more than 3 times they normally will not complete the task. All right, and one other thing about the 3-click rule, just real quick, is it is not a hard and fast rule all the time. There can be exceptions, but you'll usually find that out in usability testing. So just try to keep that in mind as you design. Okay, moving on. All right, so moving on, analytics measure human behavior on a website. They help us better understand and interpret patterns of behavior on the products we use. If they mention, if an employer mentions analytics, it's usually referring to feedback from previous testing that they have done on the site to identify where issues or concerns may be. One of the design specifications I mentioned in the 2 slides ago is essentially accessibility. Accessibility or accessible design is a design process that enables people with disabilities to interact with a product. This means you're designing for people, again, who are colorblind, blind users, deaf users, people with cognitive disabilities, that type of thing. And so you'll often hear developers talk about front and back end development. In software development, the terms front and back end refer to different segments of a product. So the front end is what we see. So think buttons, text, beautiful colors, and the layers you see on the screen when you're interacting with a product. The back end powers the front end, but we don't really see it. So think this is the code, the database, and the servers. Moving on, the conversion rate of a product or site is the percentage of users who complete a desired action. So say we're creating an e-commerce site and the desired action is to successfully purchase a product. The conversion rate would tell us how many users bought an item. So companies are looking to increase or improve their conversion rate. And conversion rate is a helpful metric for telling if your design is good or not, and to show your value as a UX designer. You could say, oh, I increased this website's conversion rate by 20%. All right, next up, I wanted to include some acronyms that you will commonly see. The first one is human-computer interaction. You'll see this abbreviation a lot, so I want to make sure you're familiar with it, even though it is a simple term that basically explains itself in the name. Human-computer interaction is a field of study concerned with the design and use of computer technology. It studies how we interact with interfaces and computers more and more in our everyday life. We can now complete almost every type of transaction online, which is vastly changing the landscape of product design and e-commerce. Next is interaction design. It's another simple term, but one that's good to know. It is the practice of designing interactive digital products and considering the way in which users will interact with them, meaning in what context will they be using your product. Picture yourself as a user. What events led you up to this point that you are now interacting with the interface of this ATM? Interaction design is all around us. It's not always limited to digital, but oftentimes it will be referring to a digital interface. Next up, we have KPI, which stands for Key Performance Indicators, which are measurable values that help us understand and track how well a product is doing. As a UX designer, you'll often work with KPIs like task success rate, user error rate, and time on task. Next, the term mockups. You will hear this get thrown around a lot in design environments. Mockups are essentially static representations of a product. You can't click on them or interact with them, so this is not like a prototype. They're essentially pictures of what the product will look like in action. So think of a finalized ad that you might see on a billboard with a shot of your app in it. Here on the right, this is an example of a mock-up. You see the app is in someone's hand, but again, you cannot interact or click on it at all. So when I was first getting into UX, I was confused as to prototype versus wireframe versus mock-up. So just keep in mind, mock-up is like the pretty polished ad that you see. Prototype is when it's those high fidelity screens that are now interactive and clickable. And then wireframes are the low to mid fidelity screens that still don't have the colors or UI. So those are most of the buzzwords that you're going to need to know for your interviews. And then I finally just briefly want to cover some UX danger words. I've touched on this briefly before. So these are going to be some red flag words that you should watch out for in job listings. If you see words like unicorn or rock star, they're usually implying that they want you to be responsible for the app from start to finish, meaning they also want you to be able to code in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it's important that you make the employer well aware that you are not a coder or developer of any kind. You offer design and research skills, not coding. Later on, if you'd like to take additional coursework to become more proficient at coding, I would encourage this, as it will make you, it'll give you a better understanding of how to collaborate with development teams in the future. However, you don't want to start too far down the road of working as both a UX designer and a developer, because oftentimes you'll end up doing the work of two people for the pay of one. And in the future, if you're ever getting a weird feeling from a job listing, you can send it to me and I'll look it over and tell you what I think about it. So just keep all these terms in mind. You could make a set of flashcards out of these terms. They're just good terms to know, industry jargon, that kind of thing. So now I'm going to take you guys through a brief portfolio review. Just to show you how I have gotten up to the point that you guys are at and where we'll go from there. Okay, so here we are in my portfolio, and I'm going to have to go through this quickly with you, but I just wanted to show you guys what your project could look like. So here I have a short about the project. You're going to want to talk about your role on the project, so you could put yourself as the lead UX designer. You're going to want to put the timeline is the 3 months that it took you to complete the Udacity course. And then you're just going to want to list any tools that you use. So far that would be Google Docs and Miro, and later on that will be Figma and things like that. And then you just want to list out your challenges here. So you could get your challenges from your user interviews so far, and just list out, what people do and don't like about the idea of your app. And then here we've got just some preliminary screens. These are high fidelity screens. The design process that I went over with you guys last week, it's always good to lay that out in your portfolio so that you can talk about it with interviewers. It's really good to have that. So then I've sectioned it off into defining the problem. I've got the problem statement, my main problems and solutions. So this is similar to that hypothesis statement, problem statement. It would be really good to go back and do those if you haven't, so that you can include those. And next we've got empathizing with the user. So these were from the user interviews. I went ahead and condensed them. You can see into these 3 people. I used their names, and I broke it down into their behaviors and attitudes, their needs and goals, their frustrations, and any important quotes that I got from them. And you just want to make it look visually appealing. And then so now I've broken down the affinity mapping. I refined it until we got to these key interview takeaways. And I talk about those last lesson as well. Here I've got the user personas and journey mapping. You don't want these to be too big because these are not the most important deliverables, so keep it small. And then here's some user flows that I've done, which you guys will be doing more coming up. And then here's the finalized site map. So I hope that helps, and go ahead and watch the next video in the series.